The London School of Economics, LSE, on the 5th of April 2014 held the Lse Africa Summit where Ghana played centre stage. A delegation of government officials, including the Minister of Finance and senior officials from the Ghana High Commission, attended the summit with the President of the Republic of Ghana, His Excellency John Mahama. The Lse Africa Summit is a forum for addressing the salient issues facing Africa, using an entrepreneurship lens in a community of leaders, businessmen, academics, and civil leaders. The theme for this year's summit was Emerging Trends in African Entrepreneurship, and the summit focused on entrepreneurship in agriculture, innovation, and finance. The summit brought together key players in Africa from the fields of entrepreneurship, innovation and finance, including Jim Ovnia, founder of Zenith Bank Group. The summit commenced with opening remarks from Sakina Badamasway, founding chair of the Lse Africa Summit. After the opening remarks, the welcome address was delivered by Craig Calhoun, director of Lse. The keynote was given by His Excellency John Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, before anything else, I would like to first congratulate the London School of Economics for organizing this summit. It is an honor for me to be here. My immediate predecessor, the late President Professor John Evans Attamills, who was an alumnus of this illustrious institution, would have been very pleased with this gathering, and he would have been especially proud that Ghana is participating in it. Forums and discussions such as these that encourage thought, analysis, and dialogue are extremely critical to nation building. Albert Einstein once said, "The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking." So in the most basic way, by being here today and sharing our ideas, we're sowing seeds, we're effecting change. Some of those changes will be evident immediately, and others will take much longer. Seeds sometimes need a while to germinate. It takes just the right set of circumstances for that to happen. I imagine that this was the case with the discussions and events that led up to the liberation in the African continent. I imagine the opinions and viewpoints that were exchanged, most probably in less formal settings, encouraged thought, analysis, and dialogue. And in those forums, ideas were shared and the seeds of African liberation were planted. I begin with the struggle for liberation because it provides the much needed context for Africa's current circumstances. It draws a map of the road we have traveled to arrive at this destination. At this intersection of determination and possibility, with prosperity right on the horizon. A prosperity that is more visible and more viable than it had ever been before. I begin with the struggle for liberation because that was without a doubt where the seeds of this economic change we have been seeing in Africa were planted. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's founding father and first president, wrote, and I quote, "The community of economic life is the major feature within a nation, and it is the economy which holds together the people living in a territory. It is on this basis that the new Africans recognize themselves as potentially one nation whose domination is the entire African continent, unquote. In 1970, when Dr. Nkrumah wrote those words, ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, had not yet been founded. Neither had the EAC, the East African Community, or SADC, the South African Development Community, or indeed any of the other regional economic communities that are currently recognized by the African Union, the organizational body that governs the continent. The seeds that Dr. Kwame Nkrumah planted all those years with that idea were merely waiting for the right set of circumstances to nurture their growth. When we speak of African liberation, we tend to think first of political sovereignty and of the journey towards democracy. We tend to think of the tremendous promise displayed by so many nations and the visionary leadership of individuals who ushered their people to independence, like Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Julius Nyerere, and Kenneth Kaunda. We tend to think of what followed their declarations of freedom, the lost decades that were marked by dictatorships and wars, corruption, and continued exploitation. It has just been in the last 2 decades that democracy has become the norm in Africa, and that universal suffrage and free and fair elections have become standard expectations instead of anomalies and exceptions. Economic independence was always considered a byproduct of democracy and political stability. Many believed that those were the set of circumstances the African continent needed to get right before sustainable growth could happen. And at first glance, they seemed to be right. At first glance, as one African country after the other experienced record GDP growth, it seemed as though what had been missing in the equation all along was just democracy and the rule of law. But in fact, that was not the case. Successful entrepreneurship and thriving enterprise do not automatically translate to self-sufficiency or economic independence. And I suspected as much. Last year, as several African countries topped the list of the world's fastest growing economies, and as newspaper headlines and conference themes boasted of an Africa rising, I couldn't help but suspect that there was more to it than met the eye. That if we were to stay on top, there were certain fundamental questions that needed to be answered. Last year at one of those Africa Rising conferences, I shared a story that I'd like to also share with all of you today. It is said that hindsight is 20/20. That with some distance, you can clearly see the patterns that have occurred in your life and in the world around you. I spoke earlier of the promise that existed in Africa during the post-independence years. That promise was almost palpable, like something you could reach out and touch or hold in the palm of your hands. We didn't realize how fragile or fleeting that promise was. And little did we know back then, in the early 70s, that it was already slipping through our fingers. It was already getting lost. And if we didn't know, then we were refusing to admit it then. To us, that promise after liberation was electricity in the air. It was loud music in the discos as we stomped to the beat in our thick platform shoes, while trying hard not to dent or otherwise disturb those huge afros we all used to wear. And yes, when I say we all used to wear, I do mean myself as well. I used to think back to those days quite often because last year there was an energy to our economic success that felt very electric. There was a sense of promise all around that felt like it would carry us on forever and ever. And when I think back to those post-independence days, I would always remember one song in particular that played often in the discos. And it was by the OJs. And the chorus of that song was one simple question, one simple but very profound question. And every time I thought about that song, it seemed to me that the question was applicable to so many of the situations in which we African countries found ourselves, especially when it came to enterprise and economy. And that question is, now that we found love, what are we going to do with it? Now that we found love, what are we going to do with it? How do we keep that spark? How do we keep that promise? And how do we sustain our success? These are the questions facing Africa today. I started this talk by speaking of independence because that is where the answers to those questions and many more can be found. You see, Africa during colonial rule was never intended to be economically independent. We were never intended to be self-sufficient. So after centuries of colonialism, after each African country had won its independence, the new government had to begin the arduous task of building the economy and society. But the entrepreneurial classes in these societies were virtually non-existent. Then too were the deliberate colonial era policies that had been designed to suppress the development of a vibrant indigenous entrepreneurial class. Those policies had become so institutionalized that they proved difficult to dismantle right away. In the case of English-speaking West Africa, the colonial authorities had brought in merchants from their other possessions, specifically India and Syria, part of which became later Lebanon, to serve as a buffer between the indigenous entrepreneurial class and the then dominant, mostly mercantilist class of Europeans. The class of European traders came to be known in an association that they formed called the Association of West African Merchants. This association was called by its acronym AWAM. And if you're Ghanaian, you'd understand what AWAM means. Their collective pricing policies and overall market practices were so predatory that the very name of the association, AWAM, entered the local vernacular and became synonymous with the words fraudulent or shady. Over half a century after independence, for many, the memory of the Association of West African Merchants, AWAM, is long gone, and there are generations of young people to whom its existence will never be known. And yet that word AWAM and its negative meaning lives on in our speeches. It is an indication of how insidious that institution and others like it truly were. After gaining independence, most African governments began to put in place their own policies and institutions, ones that were based on a state-controlled model. The rationale was that in order to bring substance to their freedom, in order to finally and fully be in charge of their own affairs, they had to take the leading role in the management of their economies. The government therefore decided they would be the providers of almost everything. Everything was state-owned. This was happening throughout the continent, and Ghana, my country, was no exception. Within a relatively short time, we had set up state-owned factories that manufactured a range of things from shoes to beer, tobacco, canned foods, building materials, cement, bricks, tiles, nails, just name it. Everything was produced by the state. The state played a role in almost every sector. There was no edict saying that the private sector could not compete, but in actuality they could not compete, at least not in manufacturing. The state enterprises were wholly supported by our taxes, and so they could be run as inefficiently as possible without turning even the slightest bit of profit, and there will be no repercussions. The one area in which the private sector did stand a chance of competing was in trade, one would have thought. But even that chance was undermined by the state's attempt to insert its reach there as well. In Ghana, we even set up the Ghana National Trading Corporation, GNTC, to run supermarkets and trade in consumer goods. Until fairly recently, private enterprise in Africa was never afforded the opportunity to grow, let alone flourish. It had no choice but to remain in its infancy. It was only after the lost decades and the liberalization of African economies that the private sector began to gain some space within which to operate. Most countries eventually came to the conclusion that the state enterprise model was just not working, and so they embarked on a privatization and a divestiture program. But growth does not happen overnight. By that time, the private sector or African entrepreneurship was still rather weak. There was no capital and no entrepreneurial training to speak of. The private sector had simply not gained enough strength to turn things around, not then at least. Growth may not happen overnight, but as I mentioned earlier, with time and the right set of circumstances, growth can and will happen. What better example of this maxim than the new rising African entrepreneurial class? This class has taken full advantage of modern technology in ICT. This class is building new types of businesses for themselves and redefining the sectors. The new African entrepreneurs can largely be found in the services sector, in banking, in telecoms, in tourism, and data, rather than the traditional sectors like manufacturing and agriculture that have historically anchored the growth of our country's GDPs. In 2010, the services sector in Ghana overtook agriculture as the largest contributor to GDP. These new African entrepreneurs are creating new paradigms, ones that are focusing the entire world to stand up and notice. Even so, African private entrepreneurs are still treated with suspicion. They've not completely escaped having to contend with state domination. They still have to cope with heavy state bureaucracy and corruption. The challenges that now face African entrepreneurs are actually vestiges of our colonialism. And the only way these challenges will be surmounted is if governments work in partnership with the private sector to break out of these patterns and continue to create new paradigms. For Africa to be fully liberated, it must be self-sufficient. Our countries must be able to play a leading role in their own development. Our countries must be able to take their economic destinies in their own hands. But the only way they can do that is by unburdening themselves of the structural economy that was bequeathed them by colonialism. That type of economy is what continues to constrain African entrepreneurship. That type of economy is what continues to promote the consumption of imported goods and the export of primary products. The exact same primary products that were being exported in our countries prior to independence. The exact same cocoa for Ghana, gold, diamonds, bauxite, palm oil, coffee, and cotton. Not much has changed in the structure of our economy. So have we come full circle? Have we traveled all this distance only to end up in the same place? Of course not. Experience is the best teacher. Most governments in Africa now know that if we are to keep the spark, to keep the promise that we have been experiencing of late, it is up to us to shoulder the heavy task of creating an enabling environment in which African enterprise can not only grow but thrive. Some places are implementing entrepreneurial incubator projects to promote and grow small and medium enterprises. Ghana is one of such countries. We're taking a particular interest in promoting entrepreneurship, especially among the youth, in order to tap into their enthusiasm and creativity. Among the facilities we have created are the Skills Development Fund, the Microfinance and Small Scales Loan Center, MASLOC, the Local Enterprise and Skills Development Program, the Integrated Community Centers for Employable Skills, the National Board for Small-Scale Industry, the Rural Enterprise Program, and the Export Development and Agricultural Investment Fund. We also have the Youth Enterprise Support Program and the Ghana Venture Capital Trust Fund. As a social democratic government, my administration is also mindful that as critical as entrepreneurship is to economic growth, it must serve a higher and greater social purpose, which is to ultimately contribute to the well-being of our people through employment, decent work, and other social services. I have personally, as president, held several group forums and discussions with numerous members of the private sector. The goals of these meetings has been to share thoughts and ideas that would eventually become the seeds of change that we could sow together in partnership and grow African enterprise. In Ghana, we're in the midst of launching a Made in Ghana campaign that will return our private sector to manufacturing many of the goods that we are currently importing but could readily make ourselves. Goods that we at one time did make ourselves under the auspices of the state-owned enterprise model. The establishment of these new Made in Ghana industries will create countless jobs in our economy. Additionally, Ghana is implementing a local content bill for the fledgling oil and gas sector in order to create a protected market for Ghanaians in that sector. The newly opened Enterprise Development Center in Takoradi has already trained 25 small and medium enterprises to provide services in oil and gas. These graduated businesses have been inputted into a database that is made available to the oil operating companies. The response to this program has been overwhelming. It has become so popular that the number of small and medium enterprises that have enrolled for the next class is 45, nearly double that of the first. Some African countries have had to momentarily take a step back from the incredible GDP increases we're experiencing over the last couple of years in order to put in place measures and programs to achieve a steady movement towards a sustainable level of success. As I said, growth doesn't happen overnight, neither does change. But that does not mean that time is on our side. Africa is a continent in a hurry. Kenneth Kaunda, the first president of Zambia, once said, "The inability of those in power to still the voices of their own conscience is a great force leading to change in Africa." Many of the seeds that are attempting to sprout their way above the ground were planted many years ago, before we even understood what they were. They were planted by the architects of our independence, the visionary individuals whose ideas were, as Kaunda said, the great force that is leading to change. Now that we've discovered the conditions under which those seeds will grow, all that is left to do is for us to keep believing and keep working while we wait for the seeds of African entrepreneurship to sprout. We must continue discussing, we must continue developing, and continue exchanging ideas for the sowing of even more seeds of African entrepreneurship. Already the African landscape is lush with a wealth of potential and opportunity. Already we are headed towards that place of prosperity on the horizon. Can you imagine the limitless possibilities that future holds for us if we only take advantage of it? A sustainable African entrepreneurship is within our reach. It takes the collective talent of our young people to be able to grasp it. And I believe that for the many young people in the London School of Economics. You are that future that Africa is looking forward to. I thank you for your attention.
That was a terrific speech.
Thank you.
Thank you. I suspect you've inspired people in the audience to go on with building that sustainable entrepreneurial future. But in the meantime, they may have some questions.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's invite their questions. The gentleman on the aisle about 2/3 of the way up there. Yes. If you can get the microphone to the gentleman on the aisle. Yeah. So no, thanks.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. One of the points that you mentioned at the very end of your speeches was the importance of local manufacture. And I know this is also something that you briefly touched on in Brussels, where you sat on the panel for SME financing and talking about building an ecosystem for financing SME development. You also briefly touched in that session on the pharmaceutical industry, of which we also agree that there's plenty of potential. And your own government, I know, has an initiative to support local manufacturers on ARV drug production. What, in your view, is, if any, is the role of government procurement policies within that ecosystem for financing local manufacture in Ghana? And I'm also pleased to say that we are holding the Africa Pharmaceutical Summit in your country in September, and we hope you honor us with your presence in Accra.
Thank you very much. Everywhere in the world, small and medium enterprises are the main drivers of economic growth, and it's the same in Africa. If we are able to support SME growth, we will create more jobs and will grow a faster economy. Unfortunately, in Africa in general and in Ghana particularly, even though SMEs constitute about 85% of business, they have access to about less than 10% of formal sector financing, that is the banking sector. And so their access to capital is a major constraint, to financing and investment is a major constraint. But that is also because the banks consider lending to the SME sector a high-risk venture. And so we need to find ways and means by which we can provide long-term affordable credit to the SME sector. And so we've used various vehicles to try and reach them directly. Unfortunately, these interventions are government-led. And as you know, government is not the best at doing any business or even pretending to be a financing institution. And so in circumstances where we've lent directly to the SME sector, we've had a very high rate of default in terms of repayment. And so we're creating a new model in which government subsidizes the financing, but still on-lends it through the banking system to the small and medium enterprises. And so that's the model that we've adopted. It's working, and I believe that it's a win-win for all of us. With regards to the pharmaceutical industry, Ghana is one of the countries in West Africa, including Nigeria, that has a growing pharmaceutical industry. We are nurturing it because we believe that that is one area in which we have a comparative advantage to be able to not only manufacture but distribute medicines, affordable medicines across the whole of the ECOWAS sub-region. And so we have been giving credit to the pharmaceutical industry. Recently, the Export Development and Agricultural Investment Fund released 50 million Ghana cedis, to the Ghanaian manufacturing sector to improve their capacity to be able to manufacture drugs for the West African sub-region. We also are working with the UN and the World Health Organization to upgrade the capacity of our pharmaceutical sector to be able to produce internationally recognized drugs and be able to take part in the supply of drugs that are done under the Global Fund. And so those are the measures that we are taking in partnership with the center, and I'm happy that your association is coming to Ghana. We would warmly welcome you.
Thank you. Okay, over here is a woman, one seat in from the aisle. She has her hand up. If you can go, well, okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk, Your Excellency. My name is Chibundu. You mentioned President Kwame Nkrumah a lot in your speech. How much of a disciple of Pan-Africanism are you? And what steps, if any, are you and your government taking towards Nkrumah's dream of a more united Africa?
Kwame Nkrumah is recognized across Africa as the great Pan-Africanist. And many years on, he is understood better in his dream about African continental unity. We, as a result of our colonial experience, have been segmented into 54 countries, literally, across the continent. Most of us cocooned into economies that by ourselves are not immediately viable. But if we open up those borders, considering that essentially we are the same people, and that in most cases those borders cut across families and cultures and people of the same language and dialects. I mean, there's the proverbial story I tell in my book about the borderline that cuts across somebody's house, and his living room is in Togo and his bedroom is in Ghana. And so when he goes to bed in the night, he's a Ghanaian. When he receives guests in the morning in his living room, he's a Togolese. You know, that's how artificial those borders are. And so we can leverage economies of scale, friendly competition, you know, to be able to improve the quality of our production if we opened up that market. If that market were open in West Africa, it's a market of 350 million people. But if you segment it country by country, then in Ghana it's a market of 24 million. In other countries it's even much smaller. In Liberia it's about 3 million people or less. And so it's a win-win situation for us. And all we need is the political will to be able to achieve the vision that not only Dr. Nkrumah but his peers, you know, advocated for a continental unity. We're starting it with the regional building blocks. That is the various regional economic communities. And it is my hope that when we strengthen these regional economic communities, we eventually take the step of creating a free trade area in the whole of Africa.
My question is too prolonged. Ghana has been an island of stability and democratic governance in Africa. Sadly, there are places in the Horn of Africa, for example, Somalia, Southern Sudan, where there's a lot of room for improvement. So what would you say were the key pillars, the key things that Ghana did to enshrine that custom of good governance into its system? And how can, what word of advice would you give to those regions in Africa to follow the same route? And the last question is, as you can see in this room, there's zillions of talent and ambition from young Africans from all backgrounds. So what would you say should the African Union and African countries do to make sure that this talent and resources are utilized to greater good? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I believe that when you dig and you reach rock bottom, there's no further down you can go. And so the only direction left is to start climbing out of the hole. And I guess that's where Ghana got to by 1983. By 1983, things were so bad, and we had gone through the turmoil and turbulence of the 70s and 80s. And so by 1983, we had reached rock bottom. Our economy was contracting. You know, production had collapsed completely, and we virtually had nowhere else to go. And so in 1992, we adopted unto ourselves a new constitution. And all the political protagonists in Ghana came to the realization that we needed a stable, democratic government that respects the human rights of everybody. And so the 1992 Constitution has been the pivotal document that turned around Ghana's fortunes. I believe that Ghana has benefited from a democracy dividend. But like I'm saying, democracy in itself will not sustain the economy and growth. We need to sow those seeds that will allow the the Ghanaian entrepreneurial class and private sector to flourish, to make sure that our economic growth is sustainable. And so I guess that's what it is. I believe that Somalia has reached that stage that Ghana was, and we can see little seeds of progress beginning to sprout. Most Somalis and other places where there are conflict realize that however long that fighting goes on, there's not going to emerge one victor. It's collective suffering and collective madness. And so there's the need to turn it around, and as more well-meaning and good-thinking Somalis come together and decide that, no, we're not going to allow this lawlessness to continue to dominate our country, I'm sure that the progress that we're beginning to see in Somalia will continue to grow. If good people stand together and say no to people who want to wreck society, good people are a force for good, but they only realize their strength when they stand together. And I believe that that's what's beginning to happen in Somalia. In West Africa, we had many conflicts. Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire went through a civil conflict. But all that has turned around, and we see that stability, respect for human rights, rule of law have begun to take hold in all these countries. I'm sure that it will happen in Somalia too.
Okay, I'm not committed to the woman I've been trying to get you to come. Keep coming forward. Farther.
Yeah, there she is standing.
Now she's standing up. Okay.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's a pleasure to meet you. Last year I was in Ghana working with students of tertiary institutions, and I noticed they have a great desire to become entrepreneurs or develop entrepreneurial skills. So my question is, does your government have any strategy to help these tertiary students to develop those entrepreneurial skills through the educational system?
Yeah, thank you. Aside from direct government intervention to try to create the right skill sets in terms of preparing young people for the world of work, we are also investing in growing young entrepreneurs. And the pilot program that we're about to start, and I'm looking forward to launch it later this month or early in May, is a Youth Enterprise Support Initiative. It's an initiative to which we've committed 10 million Ghana cedis. And we're going to go across the country and take young people and let them give us business proposals. There's going to be an independent board of trustees that is going to go through those proposals and pick the most interesting ones. And they're going to bring these young entrepreneurs together. They're going to provide them the capital to start the businesses that they propose to do. They're going to be given business people who have a proven record of doing good business to be their mentors and guide them through the process. And when these businesses have taken a firm root, they would be allowed to go into the world and fly off into the world of business. So that's one of the programs that we're working on. But there's several other civil society organizations and private organizations that are carrying out entrepreneurial incubators. We're trying to change the mindset of young people that you don't come out of school and expect that somebody will employ you, and that you could become an employer yourself. You could set up a business and also employ people. And so we need to break out of that mindset. But we need to do that by adjusting the educational curricula to match, the growing economy and the world of business. If you continue to produce, graduates in the humanities, so many of them, in an economy that is looking for a different skill set, then you're going to have a mismatch in terms of your educational curricula and what the world of business and work is looking for. We have a demand for engineers, technicians, welders, plumbers, electricians, and if you're producing hundreds of graduates in Roman civilization, there's definitely a mismatch between what business is looking for and what you're producing. And so that's one of the challenges that faces us, how to ensure that our educational system is providing the right skill set for the world of business. But very quickly, the young man talked about talents. I hope that the answer I've given to this question answers how we're using talents, especially for our young people who left the country during the worst economic period. We called it the brain drain. Today we're having what we call a brain gain, because there are a lot of young, talented Africans who left and went and worked outside and have acquired a certain work ethic and a certain skill set that is necessary back in our economies. And many of them, as a result, thank God for the financial crisis in the West.
We aren't entirely glad to have contributed.
Are packing bag and baggage and coming back home. And we now call it a brain gain. And so that's a good thing. It's my hope that with the skills that all these young, beautiful people are acquiring here, you'll come back home and help to make our economic growth sustainable.
Okay. Hello, Your Excellency. It's a pleasure to meet you. My question is the inflow of Chinese businesses killing domestic businesses? And if so, what can we do about it as fellow Ghanaians? Thank you.
Okay, let's get both questions, and if you're willing to take both together. Chinese business.
So, hello, Your Excellency. My name is Sephora. My question is, what is Ghana's attitude towards PPP, public-private partnerships, and would you advise other head of African states, such as, me, I'm originally from Cote d'Ivoire, President Alassane Ouattara, to kind of implement it as well? And also, what is Ghana or maybe other African head of states doing about internships? Because I know you have emphasized about, most of us, the diaspora, kind of going back home to work there. But what about those originally who are from Ghana who have issues in terms of finding employment but not really getting paid well for it? So even if they have an internship, the expenses are not being paid. Is there policies that the government can implement so that they can at least have the minimum wage as we have here to support them to reach their potential, especially if they are from very poorer backgrounds?
Okay, I don't know if I understood you well, but what you're talking about, what guaranteed income there'll be for people who go back home. I don't know if that was a...
I'm referring to a fellow Ghanaian he's currently in Ghana, who's found an internship but is not getting paid a minimum wage, or not having the travel or the expenses being paid. Because I've heard quite a few stories like that where they don't get as much support from certain their working environments, so they can't afford certain things. Is there a policy that do you think the government can implement that makes it compulsory for people who are having internships, especially that are from poor backgrounds already in Africa, to be supported in that way? That's clear.
Very complex question, but in Ghana we have a minimum wage, and we've had a minimum wage for many years. Every year, organized labor negotiates with government and sets a minimum wage. It's not legislated, it's indicative. And so it tells employers that you cannot pay people below this level. And so we've had that for many years. But aside from the minimum wage, employers negotiate with their employees what their collective bargaining agreements should be and what the wage levels should be. And indeed, there are some employers who pay very well, especially in the private sector. There are several, private sector organizations that earn much, much, much more than even the president, maybe 10 times more what my salary is. And so they're good jobs. It depends on what skill sets you come to the job with. And it depends on in what sector of the economy you find that job. And so depending on where you go in the energy sector, in the oil and gas sector, in the services sector, financial services sector, there are some super jobs that I probably should be doing rather than, sitting here as president, because certainly I'll be earning much more than that. With regards to Chinese products, I think Chinese products, it's not only Africa, it's everywhere in the world. Chinese products are, competing with everybody's local production. And so what happens, the advantage China has is it has a huge market, probably the biggest market in the world. And so they have economies of scale. If you produce televisions in China and the national demand for televisions is, say, 60 million sets, after producing a couple of million sets, you probably would have paid off your production and you can afford to, sell the others at cost or less than cost and not be affected. But then if you have a smaller market, you're producing for a smaller market, then it makes it difficult for you to compete with some of these companies. But I do think that there are areas in which Africa has comparative advantages, and we should try and put in the capacity to produce some of those things ourselves. I mean, I don't see why in Ghana we have the forest, we have bamboo. I mean, if you plant bamboo anywhere, it will grow. I don't see why we should use toothpicks produced in China. That's just an example. You go to the market and there are all these plastic dolls and plastic toys and things, that could be produced locally. And I believe that the Ghanaian entrepreneurial class, rather than just look at commerce, can look at manufacturing and light industry and also be able to compete in that market. But like I said, the future for Africa and West Africa is to open up the markets to have the comparative advantage and economies of scale too. And so if you have African producers having a market of 350 million, probably they can compete better with China than if you're producing for a market of 10 million people or 20 million people.
But one of the big problems that we still face in Africa today is the high level of poverty. How are African leaders going about this issue? I don't know what's correct, but what we read on the internet is that there's something like 70% poverty levels in Africa. If that's correct, this is a very, very big percentage, and I just wonder what African leaders are doing to alleviate this problem. Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick one. I think there was a question on PPPs, public-private partnerships. Yeah, that's the way to go. We believe that government on its own cannot leverage all the financing to invest in infrastructure and strategic industry. And so government needs to form strategic partnerships with the private sector to be able to do that. And that's one of the policies we're championing in Ghana. And we're seeing very good success with it, especially in the energy sector. We have examples of public-private partnerships where we have independent power producers linking up with government to produce power and feed it into the national grid, to feed Ghana's own demand, and if possible, export to neighboring countries. So that's something we're working on. With regards to poverty, I don't know where you're getting your figures from. 70% poverty, I'm not sure. I guess the figure is much lower. A lot of countries in Africa have made very good progress in terms of meeting the Millennium Development Goals of reducing poverty. My country, Ghana, for instance, achieved the MDG target far in advance of the 2015 deadline. Not only poverty, but also reducing hunger. We have reduced hunger and malnutrition to less than 5% today. And so a lot of progress is being made, yes. Of course, there are pockets of poverty, there's no doubt about it. And I'm sure that even if you went to developed countries, even here in the UK, you find pockets of poverty. What you need to do is to continue to work to ensure that there's social inclusion. It is exclusion that creates some of the crises and conflicts that we see. If people see that they have no stake in the existence of the state, they'll take up arms against the state. And so you cannot leave a society where you don't have social safety nets that make people able to live at least a certain decent and dignified life. And that is what we're doing in Ghana with the Livelihood Empowerment Against Poverty program, where we've identified 77,000 of the poorest households and are doing direct cash transfers to these households to be able to ensure that they can buy health insurance and be able to access quality health care, to ensure that they are able to send their children to school. And so I do think that, yes, the fight against poverty is on, and we are winning, we're making progress, but we need to factor in the changing demographics in Africa. Africa has the fastest growing population, and it's estimated that that population is going to increase phenomenally. And so we must be creating opportunities for the many young people that are coming, especially out of school, to be able to find jobs and realize their full potential.
Okay. There are 100 hands up, and we're getting towards the last question. The gentleman over against the wall in about the fourth row. Yeah.
Good morning, Your Excellency. I just had one more question to bring it back to China. I just wanted to ask, how is it that this rising African continent still has to have its biggest symbol, the African Union building, I guess financed by a foreign country? I never understood it, and I'll probably never get a chance to ask a sitting president. I know you probably weren't president when it was, but I wanted to ask because it's just mind-blowing to me.
Well, I don't know the genesis of that building because I wasn't president then, but it's said to represent the symbol of friendship between Africa and China. And I guess that there are many things that the African Union can do to improve the lives of Africans, and I guess that that's what the Union is working on. And if China decides to save you that money and you can use it on something else, why not?
Okay. Good morning, Your Excellency. My name is Oni Nyado. I've created a few leadership and entrepreneurship programs here in the UK, and I want to know what opportunities are there for someone like myself to partner along with your government in the programs that you're rolling out?
Well, I mentioned several programs, and we are open to partnership, especially technical cooperation with people who have the expertise to be able to do these things. As I've said, we're moving from the state-owned model to partnerships with the private sector. And so for some of these models of entrepreneurship that government wants to sponsor or is standing behind, we are willing to partner with private entrepreneurs to be able to create more incubators and create more young entrepreneurs. So that's an opportunity we can explore.
You very succinctly mentioned the historical perspective of Africa's colonial links, but I also want to refer to one of your presentations at the World Economic Forum in January, in which you were on a panel with one of the presidents of Africa, and Mr. Jim Oviatu was in the audience too. Yeah. at this session. You talked about the colonial strand too in that presentation. I want to bring you back to one of the questions I was asked, specifically around trade. We find it that it's much more expensive for many African countries to trade among themselves than to trade with European countries. So what are you actually doing as regards increasing the trade between African countries? Because that's the greatest opportunities that there are. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, just very quickly, you are preaching to the converted. I'm an apostle of integration. And if I had my way, would open up those borders and let the goods and services flow. It's a win-win for everybody. And I believe that Nigeria, has a certain responsibility in West Africa because it's the largest economy, it's the most populous country. And Nigeria has nothing to fear from Ghana in terms of competition. Nigeria has nothing to fear from Cote d'Ivoire in terms of competition. Nigeria has nothing to fear from Benin or Togo or Niger in terms of competition. And yet, year in, year out, there's a prohibition list. Even though we've all signed the protocol on ETLS, the ECOWAS trade liberalization, and we have products that are registered under ETLS, the prohibitions list in Nigeria does not allow you to take textiles into Nigeria, processed goods into Nigeria, and that is part of the stumbling block in terms of our integration. I mean, in Ghana, if you bring an ETLS registered good and you want to import it into Ghana, you bring it in duty-free, quota-free, but not the same, the reverse. I think it's a certain misconception, and a certain not really tangible fear that if the market is open, it would bring competition and make some people lose out in the Nigerian market. I think the Nigerian market is big enough. It needs competition to improve efficiency and build capacity. And so we continue to work. President Jonathan is a friend. I've told him this. I said, look, you need to show the way in West Africa. You are the largest economy. You must open up your market. Let our industries compete. It will be to the benefit of all of us. And so I'm an apostle of integration. You know, we just need the political will to be able to make it work and to make sure that we don't have our border controls and police officers standing on the roads and taking these petty bribes from exporters and importers and all that kind of thing. That's the way to go.
Okay, that's a great sort of action item to end on. Entrepreneurs need open markets. Yes. Africa needs integration. And thank you for your leadership. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.